In 2006, during the annual Mardi Gras celebration in Florida, a group of new Navy recruits and their families boarded a cruise ship to enjoy the festival. But as the ship barely left the port, a massive explosion ripped through the vessel, killing over 500 people on board. The tragic event sparked national outrage, and the government quickly dispatched Doug, a seasoned explosives investigator from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms (ATF), to the scene. Doug had seen his fair share of devastating incidents, but nothing could prepare him for the sight that awaited him. As he surveyed the wreckage, he found rows of heavily burned bodies, a gruesome scene that left him deeply shaken. Among the charred remains, Doug discovered a blue fragment with hidden wires inside it, confirming his worst fear. The explosion was a deliberate act of terrorism. The thick smoke and pungent odor that lingered in the air made it clear that the explosion had been carefully planned. Back at the ATF office, Doug received a strange piece of information. A colleague told him that a woman had called earlier, inquiring about Doug's height and appearance, sounding desperate as if she were in trouble. Doug couldn't shake the feeling that this was somehow connected to the cruise ship bombing. He quickly tried to call her back, but the voicemail informed him that no one was available. With no other choice, Doug left a message. Later that afternoon, the police made a disturbing discovery. A woman's body was found floating near the docks. The victim was Claire, and her body had been severely burned. But what made the case even more chilling was the fact that her 5 fingers had been completely severed. Initially, both Doug and the police assumed Claire was another victim of the cruise explosion. However, after a closer look, they realized something didn't add up. The coroner confirmed that Claire's body had been found at 10:40 a.m., while the cruise ship explosion occurred at 10:50 a.m., just 10 minutes later. The timeline suggested that the two events were completely separate. Doug's gut feeling told him otherwise. The close timing couldn't be a coincidence. Doug theorized that Claire had uncovered the bomber's plans and was murdered to keep her quiet. The explosion might have been set off to cover up her death. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Doug decided to investigate Claire's home. As Doug entered Claire's house, he was immediately struck by a message made of fridge magnets. "You can save him." It felt like someone had anticipated his visit. Then his eyes caught a car sales ad stuck to the fridge. In the trash, he found blood-stained gauze. What shocked Doug even more was a voicemail he had received that morning. It turned out that Claire had been the one who called him earlier. Doug quickly reported his findings to the Bureau. Combining the evidence with the ongoing police investigation, they concluded that the bomb had likely been hidden in a car, which was then transported to the cruise ship. This car was probably the one Claire had been trying to sell. Doug was now convinced that following this lead would be key to finding the bomber. As Doug was thinking through his next steps, he noticed his colleague Ross's car parked outside. He planned to call Ross to join him in the investigation, but just as he was about to make the call, the police delivered heartbreaking news. Ross had died in the cruise explosion, and his body had already been processed. The news hit Doug like a thunderbolt. Ross wasn't just a colleague. He was like a brother, someone Doug had been through thick and thin with. Grief-stricken, Doug was suddenly approached by a special operations team that took him to a heavily guarded military base. The person in charge explained that Doug's expertise in solving complex cases could be crucial in identifying the bomber. They had access to a piece of technology unlike anything Doug had ever seen, a machine that could review events from 4 days ago. Using satellite surveillance, the machine could show exactly what had happened 4 days earlier. But there was a catch. It could only be viewed once, and the footage would then vanish forever. Doug, still reeling from the loss of his friend, began to study the footage carefully. To his surprise, Claire appeared on the screen, but something was wrong. It looked like Claire could sense she was being watched. She looked directly at the screen and spoke out in fear. "Hello?" Doug tried to use a laser pointer to signal her, but when he did, something even stranger happened. Claire seemed to notice the laser and reacted as though she could see it. Suddenly, the facility lost power. When it returned, Doug was furious. He felt the authorities were hiding something. The staff revealed that Cambridge University had developed technology that folded time, allowing them to see 4 days into the past. Doug was stunned. If they could reach into the past, why not stop the bombing? The staff explained that sending physical matter back was impossible due to energy limitations. However, they agreed to send a note with clues to prevent the disaster. But when it arrived, Doug wasn't there. His colleague Ross found it instead. Ross rushed to stop the bomber, but was shot and killed. Watching this unfold, Doug felt overwhelming guilt. realizing his interference had caused Ross's death. But he had no time to mourn. He had to act quickly. Using an IM device, he tracked the killer, Carol Erstadt, and uncovered a link between him and Claire's murder. The police arrested Carol, who confessed to bombing a Navy cruise out of revenge for being rejected by the military. Determined to prevent the tragedy, Doug ignored warnings and used the time machine to go back 4 days. He woke up disoriented in a hospital, but had only 2 hours to stop the bombing. Injured but relentless, he rescued Claire and engaged in a deadly showdown with Carol. In the final moments, with seconds left before the explosion, Doug drove the bomb-rigged car into the water, sacrificing himself to prevent the disaster. As the explosion erupted beneath the waves, Claire was left devastated, believing Doug was gone forever. However, back on the cruise ship, a police officer introduced her to an explosives expert. To her shock, it was Doug, this timeline's version of him. They exchanged a knowing look, both realizing that while he couldn't save everything, he had made a difference. Doug, still trying to process everything, wondered if his actions had truly changed fate or if time had simply corrected itself in another way. Claire, shaken but grateful, struggled to understand how a man who had saved her life could also be meeting her for the first time. Despite her confusion, she felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if some part of Doug remembered what had happened. As they walked away together, Doug couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unfinished. The technology that allowed him to travel through time remained operational, and he now knew just how dangerous it could be. With new questions and unresolved mysteries, Doug realized his fight wasn't over yet.